Osterman's dexterity had at last succeeded in entangling Magnus inextricably in the new politics. The famous league, organized in the heat of passion the night of Annixter's barn dance, had been consolidated all through the winter months. Its executive committee, of which Magnus was chairman, had been, through Osterman's manipulation, merged into the old committee composed of Broderson, Annixter, and himself. Promptly thereat he had resigned the chairmanship of this committee, leaving Magnus at its head. Precisely as Osterman had planned, Magnus was now one of them. The new committee accordingly had two objects in view: to resist the attempted grabbing of their lands by the railroad, and to push forward their own secret scheme of electing a board of railroad commissioners who should regulate wheat rates so as to favor the ranchers of the San Joaquin. The land cases were promptly taken to the courts, and the new grading, fixing the price of the lands at $20 and $30 an acre instead of $2, bitterly and stubbornly fought. But delays occurred, the process of the law was interminable, and in the intervals the committee addressed itself to the work of seating the Ranchers' Commission, as the projected Board of Commissioners came to be called. It was Herron who first suggested that his brother, Lyman, be put forward as the candidate for this district. At once the proposition had a great success. Lyman seemed made for the place. While allied by every tie of blood to the ranching interests, he had never been identified with them. He was city-bred. The railroad would not be over-suspicious of him. He was a good lawyer, a good businessman, keen, clear-headed, far-sighted, had already some practical knowledge of politics, having served a term as assistant district attorney, and even at the present moment occupying the position of sheriff's attorney. More than all, he was the son of Magnus Derrick. He could be relied upon, could be trusted implicitly to remain loyal to the rancher's cause. The campaign for railroad commissioner had been very interesting. At the very outset, Magnus' committee found itself involved in corrupt politics. The primaries had to be captured at all costs and by any means, and when the convention assembled, it was found necessary to buy outright the votes of certain delegates. The campaign fund, raised by contributions from Magnus, Annixter, Broderson, and Osterman, was drawn upon to the extent of $5,000. Only the committee knew of this corruption. The League, ignoring ways and means, supposed as a matter of course that the campaign was honorably conducted. For a whole week after the consummation of this part of the deal, Magnus had kept to his house, refusing to be seen, alleging that he was ill, which was not far from the truth. The shame of the business, the loathing of what he had done, were to him things unspeakable. He could no longer look Herron in the face. He began a course of deception with his wife. More than once he had resolved to break with the whole affair, resigning his position, allowing the others to proceed without him. But now it was too late. He was pledged. He had joined the League. He was its chief, and his defection might mean its disintegration at the very time when it needed all its strength to fight the land cases. More than a mere deal in bad politics was involved. There was the land grab. His withdrawal from an unholy cause would mean the weakening, perhaps the collapse, of another cause that he believed to be righteous as truth itself. He was hopelessly caught in the mesh. Wrong seemed indissolubly knitted into the texture of right. He was blinded, dizzied, overwhelmed, caught in the current of events, and hurried along he knew not where. He resigned himself. In the end, and after much ostentatious opposition on the part of the railroad heelers, Lyman was nominated and subsequently elected. When this consummation was reached, Magnus, Osterman, Broderson, and Annixter stared at each other. Their wildest hopes had not dared to fix themselves upon so easy a victory as this. It was not believable that the corporation would allow itself to be fooled so easily, would rush open-eyed into the trap. How had it happened? Osterman, however, threw his hat into the air with wild whoops of delight. Old Broderson permitted himself a feeble cheer. Even Magnus beamed satisfaction. The other members of the League, present at the time, shook hands all around and spoke of opening a few bottles on the strength of the occasion. Annixter alone was recalcitrant. "It's too easy," he declared. "No, I'm not satisfied. Where is Shelgrim in all this? Why don't he show his hand, damn his soul? The thing is yellow, I tell you. There's a big fish in these waters somewheres. I don't know his name, and I don't know his game, but he's moving round off and on, just out of sight. If you think you've netted him, I don't. That's all I've got to say." But he was jeered down as a croaker. There was the commission. He couldn't get around that, could he? There was Darrell and Lyman Derrick, both pledged to the ranches. Good Lord, he was never satisfied. He'd be obstinate till the very last gun was fired. Why, if he got drowned in a river, he'd float upstream just to be contrary. In the course of time, the new board was seated. For the first few months of its term, it was occupied in clearing up the business left over by the old board and in the completion of the railway map. But now the decks were cleared. It was about to address itself to the consideration of a revision of the tariff for the carriage of grain between the San Joaquin Valley and Tidewater. Both Lyman and Darrell were pledged to an average 10% cut of the grain rates throughout the entire state. The typewriter returned with the letters for Lyman to sign, and he put away the map and took up his morning's routine of business, wondering the while what would become of his practice during the time he was involved in the business of the Ranchers' Railroad Commission. But toward noon, at the moment when Lyman was drawing off a glass of mineral water from the siphon that stood at his elbow, there was an interruption. Someone rapped vigorously upon the door, which was immediately after opened, and Magnus and Harron came in, followed by Presley. "Hello, hello," cried Lyman, jumping up, extending his hands. "Why, here's a surprise. I didn't expect you all till tonight. Come in and sit down. Have a glass of Sizwater, Governor." The others explained that they had come up from Bonneville the night before, as the executive committee of the League had received a dispatch from the lawyers it had retained to fight the railroad, that the judge of the court in San Francisco, where the test cases were being tried, might be expected to hand down his decision the next day. Very soon after the announcement of the new grading of the ranchers' lands, the corporation had offered, through S. Behrman, to lease the disputed lands to the ranchers at a nominal figure. The offer had been angrily rejected, and the railroad had put up the lands for sale at Ruggles' office in Bonneville. At the exorbitant price named, buyers promptly appeared, dummy buyers, beyond shadow of doubt, acting either for the railroad or for S. Behrman, men hitherto unknown in the county, men without property, without money, adventurers, healers. Prominent among them, and bidding for the railroad's holdings included on Annixter's ranch, was Delaney. The farce of deeding the corporation's section to these fictitious purchasers was solemnly gone through with at Ruggles' office, the railroad guaranteeing them possession. The League refused to allow the supposed buyers to come upon the land, and the railroad, faithful to its pledge in the matter of guaranteeing its dummies possession, at once began suits in ejectment in the district court in Visalia, the county seat. It was the preliminary skirmish, the reconnaissance in force, the combatants feeling each other's strength, willing to proceed with caution, postponing the actual death grip for a while till each had strengthened its position and organized its forces. During the time the cases were on trial at Visalia, S. Behrman was much in evidence in and about the courts. The trial itself, after tedious preliminaries, was brief. The ranchers lost. The test cases were immediately carried up to the United States Circuit Court in San Francisco. At the moment, the decision of this court was pending. "Why, this is news," exclaimed Lyman, in response to the governor's announcement. "I did not expect them to be so prompt. I was in court only last week, and there seemed to be no end of business ahead. I suppose you are very anxious." Magnus nodded. He had seated himself in one of Lyman's deep chairs, his gray top hat with its wide brim on the floor beside him. His coat of black broadcloth, that had been tightly packed in his valise, was yet wrinkled and creased. His trousers were strapped under his high boots. As he spoke, he stroked the bridge of his hawk-like nose with his bent forefinger. Leaning back in his chair, he watched his two sons with secret delight. To his eye, both were perfect specimens of their class, intelligent, well-looking, resourceful. He was intensely proud of them. He was never happier, never more nearly jovial, never more erect, more military, more alert and buoyant than when in the company of his two sons. He honestly believed that no finer examples of young manhood existed throughout the entire nation. "I think we should win in this court," Harron observed, watching the bubbles break in his glass. "The investigation has been much more complete than in the Visalia trial. Our case this time is too good. It has made too much talk. The court would not dare render a decision for the railroad. Why, there's the agreement in black and white, and the circulars the railroad issued. How can one get around those?" "Well, we shall know in a few hours now," remarked Magnus. "Oh," exclaimed Lyman, surprised. "It is for this morning, then. Why aren't you at the court?" "It seemed undignified, boy," answered the governor. "We shall know soon enough." "Good God!" exclaimed Harron abruptly. "When I think of what is involved. Why, Lyman, it's our home, the ranch house itself, nearly all Los Muertos, practically our whole fortune. And just now when there is promise of an enormous crop of wheat. And it is not only us. There are over 500,000 acres of the San Joaquin involved. In some cases of the smaller ranches, it is the confiscation of the whole of the rancher's land. If this thing goes through, it will absolutely beggar nearly 100 men. Robertson wouldn't have 1,000 acres to his name. Why, it's monstrous." "But the corporations offered to lease these lands," remarked Lyman. "Are any of the ranchers taking up that offer, or are any of them buying outright?" "Buying at the new figure?" exclaimed Harron. "At 20 and 30 an acre? Why, there's not 1 in 10 that can. They are land poor. And as for leasing land they virtually own, no, there's precious few are doing that, thank God. That would be acknowledging the railroad's ownership right away, forfeiting their rights for good. None of the Leaguers are doing it, I know. That would be the rankest treachery." He paused for a moment, drinking the rest of the mineral water, then interrupting Lyman, who was about to speak to Presley, drawing him into the conversation through politeness, said, "Matters are just romping right along to a crisis these days. It's a make or break for the wheat growers of the state now, no mistake. Here are the land cases and the new grain tariff drawing to a head at about the same time. If we win our land cases, there's your new freight rates to be applied, and then all is beer and skittles. Won't the San Joaquin go wild if we pull it off? And I believe we will." "How we wheat growers are exploited and trapped and deceived at every turn," observed Magnus sadly. "The courts, the capitalists, the railroads, each of them in turn hoodwinks us into some new and wonderful scheme, only to betray us in the end. Well," he added, turning to Lyman, "one thing at least we can depend on. We will cut their grain rates for them, eh, Lyman?" Lyman crossed his legs and settled himself in his office chair. "I have wanted to have a talk with you about that, sir," he said. "Yes, we will cut the rates, an average 10% cut throughout the states, as we are pledged. But I am going to warn you, Governor, and you, Harron, don't expect too much at first. The man who, even after 20 years' training in the operation of railroads, can draw an equitable, smoothly working schedule of freight rates between shipping point and common point is capable of governing the United States. What with main lines and leased lines and points of transfer, and the laws governing common carriers and the rulings of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the whole matter has become so confused that Vanderbilt himself couldn't straighten it out. And how can it be expected that railroad commissions who are chosen, well, let's be frank, as ours was, for instance, from out a number of men who don't know the difference between a switching charge and a differential rate, are going to regulate the whole business in 6 months' time? Cut rates, yes, any fool can do that. Any fool can write $1 instead of 2. But if you cut too low by a fraction of 1%, and if the railroad can get out an injunction, tie you up and show that your new rate prevents the road from being operated at a profit, how are you any better off?" "Your conscientiousness does you credit, Lyman," said the governor. "I respect you for it, my son. I know you will be fair to the railroad. That is all we want. Fairness to the corporation is fairness to the farmer, and we won't expect you to readjust the whole matter out of hand. Take your time. We can afford to wait. And suppose the next commission is a railroad board and reverses all our figures." The one-time mining king, the most redoubtable poker player of Calaveras County, permitted himself a momentary twinkle of his eyes. "By then it will be too late. We will, all of us, have made our fortunes by then." The remark left Presley astonished out of all measure. He never could accustom himself to these strange lapses in the governor's character. Magnus was by nature a public man, judicious, deliberate, standing firm for principle, Yet upon rare occasions, by some such remark as this, he would betray the presence of a sub-nature of recklessness inconsistent at all variance with his creeds and tenets. At the very bottom, when all was said and done, Magnus remained the 49er. Deep down in his heart, the spirit of the adventurer yet persisted. We will all of us have made fortunes by then. That was it precisely. After us the deluge. For all his public spirit, for all his championship of justice and truth, his respect for law, Magnus remained the gambler, willing to play for colossal stakes, to hazard a fortune on the chance of winning $1 million. It was the true California spirit that found expression through him, the spirit of the West, unwilling to occupy itself with details, refusing to wait, to be patient, to achieve by legitimate plodding. The miner's instinct of wealth acquired in a single night prevailed, in spite of all. It was in this frame of mind that Magnus and the multitude of other ranchers of whom he was a type farmed their ranches. They had no love for their land. They were not attached to the soil. They worked their ranches as a quarter of a century before they had worked their minds. To husband the resources of their marvelous San Joaquin they considered niggardly, petty, Hebraic. To get all there was out of the land, to squeeze it dry, to exhaust it, seemed their policy. When, at last, the land, worn out, would refuse to yield, they would invest their money in something else. By then they would all have made fortunes. They did not care. After us the deluge. Lyman, however, was obviously uneasy, willing to change the subject. He rose to his feet, pulling down his cuffs. "By the way," he observed, "I want you three to lunch with me today at my club. It is close by. You can wait there for news of the court's decision as well as anywhere else, and I should like to show you the place. I have just joined." At the club, when the four men were seated at a small table in the round window of the main room, Lyman's popularity with all classes was very apparent. Hardly a man entered that did not call out a salutation to him, some even coming over to shake his hand. He seemed to be every man's friend, and to all he seemed equally genial. His affability, even to those whom he disliked, was unfailing. "See that fellow yonder," he said to Magnus, indicating a certain middle-aged man, flamboyantly dressed, who wore his hair long, who was afflicted with sore eyes, and the collar of whose velvet coat was sprinkled with dandruff. "That's Hartrath, the artist, a man absolutely devoid of even the commonest decency. How he got in here is a mystery to me." Yet when this Hartrath came across to say "How do you do" to Lyman, Lyman was as eager in his cordiality as his warmest friend could have expected. "Why the devil are you so chummy with him, then?" observed Harron when Hartrath had gone away. Lyman's explanation was vague. The truth of the matter was that Magnus' oldest son was consumed by inordinate ambition. Political preferment was his dream, and to the realization of his dream popularity was an essential. Every man who could vote, blackguard or gentleman, was to be conciliated if possible. He made it his study to become known throughout the entire community, to put influential men under obligations to himself. He never forgot a name or a face. With everybody he was the hail fellow well met. His ambition was not trivial. In his disregard for small things he resembled his father. Municipal office had no attraction for him. His goal was higher. He had planned his life 20 years ahead. Already sheriff's attorney, assistant district attorney, and railroad commissioner, he could, if he desired, attain the office of district attorney itself. Just now it was a question with him whether or not it would be politic to fill this office. Would it advance or sidetrack him in the career he had outlined for himself? Lyman wanted to be something better than district attorney, better than mayor, than state senator, or even than member of the United States Congress. He wanted to be, in fact, what his father was only in name, to succeed where Magnus had failed. He wanted to be governor of the state. He had put his teeth together, and, deaf to all other considerations, blind to all other issues, he worked with the infinite slowness, the unshakable tenacity of the coral insect to this one end. After luncheon was over, Lyman ordered cigars and liqueurs, and with the three others returned to the main room of the club. However, their former place in the round window was occupied. A middle-aged man with iron-gray hair and mustache, who wore a frock coat and a white waistcoat, and in some indefinable manner suggested a retired naval officer, was sitting at their table smoking a long, thin cigar. At sight of him, Presley became animated. He uttered a mild exclamation. "Why, isn't that Mr. Cedarquist?" "Cedarquist?" repeated Lyman Derrick. "I know him well. Yes, of course it is," he continued. "Governor, you must know him. He is one of our representative men. You would enjoy talking to him. He was the head of the big Atlas Iron Works. They have shut down recently, you know. Not failed exactly, but just ceased to be a paying investment, and Cedarquist closed them out. He has other interests, though. He's a rich man, a capitalist." Lyman brought the group up to the gentleman in question and introduced them. "Mr. Magnus Derrick, of course," observed Cedarquist as he shook the governor's hand. "I've known you by repute for some time, sir. This is a great pleasure, I assure you." Then, turning to Presley, he added, "Hello, Press, my boy. How is the very great poem getting on?" "It's not getting on at all, sir," answered Presley, in some embarrassment, as they all sat down. "In fact, I've about given up the idea. There's so much interest in what you might call living issues down at Los Muertos now that I'm getting farther and farther from it every day." "I should say as much," remarked the manufacturer, turning toward Magnus. "I'm watching your fight with Shelgrim, Mr. Derrick, with every degree of interest." He raised his drink of whiskey and soda. "Here's success to you." As he replaced his glass, the artist Hartrath joined the group uninvited. As a pretext, he engaged Lyman in conversation. Lyman, he believed, was a man with a pull at the City Hall. In connection with a projected $1,000,000 fair and flower festival, which at that moment was the talk of the city, certain statues were to be erected, and Hartrath bespoke Lyman's influence to further the pretensions of a sculptor friend of his who wished to be art director of the affair. In the matter of this fair and flower festival, Hartrath was not lacking in enthusiasm. He addressed the others with extravagant gestures, blinking his inflamed eyelids. $1,000,000, he exclaimed. "Hey, think of that! Why, do you know that we have 500,000 practically pledged already? Talk about public spirit, gentlemen. This is the most public-spirited city on the continent. And the money is not thrown away. We will have Eastern visitors here by the thousands, capitalists, men with money to invest. The $1,000,000 we spend on our fair will be money in our pockets. Ah, you should see how the women of this city are taking hold of the matter. They are giving all kinds of little entertainments, teas, old-time singing schools, amateur theatricals, gingerbread fêtes, all for the benefit of the fund, and the businessmen, too, pouring out their money like water. It is splendid, splendid to see a community so patriotic." The manufacturer, Cedarquist, fixed the artist with a glance of melancholy interest. "And how much," he remarked, "will they contribute, your gingerbread women and public-spirited capitalists, toward the blowing up of the ruins of the Atlas Iron Works?" "Blowing up? I don't understand," murmured the artist, surprised. "When you get your Eastern capitalists out here with your $1,000,000 fair," continued Cedarquist, "you don't propose, do you, to let them see a $1,000,000 iron foundry standing idle because of the indifference of San Francisco businessmen? They might ask pertinent questions, your capitalists, and we should have to answer that our businessmen preferred to invest their money in corner lots and government bonds rather than to back up a legitimate industrial enterprise. We don't want fairs. We want active furnaces. We don't want public statues and fountains and park extensions and gingerbread fêtes. We want business enterprise. Isn't it like us? Isn't it like us?" he exclaimed sadly. "What a melancholy comment. San Francisco. It is not a city. It is a midway plaisance. California likes to be fooled. Do you suppose Shelgrim could convert the whole San Joaquin Valley into his backyard otherwise? Indifference to public affairs, absolute indifference. It stamps us all. Our state is the very paradise of fakirs. You and your $1,000,000 fair." He turned to Hartrath with a quiet smile. "It is just such men as you, Mr. Hartrath, that are the ruin of us. You organize a sham of tinsel and pasteboard, put on fool's cap and bells, beat a gong at a street corner, and the crowd cheers you and drops nickels into your hat. Your gingerbread fête. Yes, I saw it in full blast the other night on the grounds of one of your women's places on Sutter Street. I was on my way home from the last board meeting of the Atlas Company. A gingerbread fete. My God! And the Atlas plant shutting down for want of financial backing? $1 million spent to attract the Eastern investor in order to show him an abandoned rolling mill wherein the only activity is the sale of remnant material and scrap steel? Lyman, however, interfered. The situation was becoming strained. He tried to conciliate the three men, the artist, the manufacturer, and the farmer, the warring elements. But Hartrath, unwilling to face the enmity that he felt accumulating against him, took himself away. A picture of his, a study of the Contra Costa foothills, was to be raffled in the club rooms for the benefit of the fair. He himself was in charge of the matter. He disappeared. Cedarquist looked after him with contemplative interest. Then, turning to Magnus, excused himself for the acridity of his words. He's no worse than many others, and the people of this state and city are, after all, only a little more addle-headed than other Americans. It was his favorite topic. Sure of the interest of his hearers, he unburdened himself. If I were to name the one crying evil of American life, Mr. Derrick, he continued, it would be the indifference of the better people to public affairs. It is so in all our great centers. There are other great trusts, God knows, in the United States besides our own dear P&S.W. Railroad. Every state has its own grievance. If it is not a railroad trust, it is a sugar trust, or an oil trust, or an industrial trust that exploits the people, because the people allow it. The indifference of the people is the opportunity of the despot. It is as true as that the whole is greater than the part, and the maxim is so old that it is trite. It is laughable. It is neglected and disused for the sake of some new ingenious and complicated theory, some wonderful scheme of reorganization, but the fact remains, nevertheless, simple, fundamental, everlasting. The people have but to say no, and not the strongest tyranny, political, religious, or financial, that was ever organized could survive 1 week. The others, absorbed, attentive, approved, nodding their heads in silence as the manufacturer finished. "That's one reason, Mr. Derrick," the other resumed after a moment, "why I have been so glad to meet you. You and your league are trying to say no to the trust. I hope you will succeed. If your example will rally the people to your cause, you will. Otherwise—" he shook his head. "One stage of the fight is to be passed this very day," observed Magnus. "My sons and myself are expecting hourly news from the City Hall. A decision in our case is pending." "We are both of us fighters, it seems, Mr. Derrick," said Cedarquist, "each with his particular enemy. We are well met, indeed, the farmer and the manufacturer, both in the same grist between the two millstones of the lethargy of the public and the aggression of the trust, the two great evils of modern America. Press, my boy, there is your epic poem ready to hand." But Cedarquist was full of another idea. Rarely did so favorable an opportunity present itself for explaining his theories, his ambitions. Addressing himself to Magnus, he continued, "Fortunately for myself, the Atlas Company was not my only investment. I have other interests. The building of ships, steel sailing ships, has been an ambition of mine. For this purpose, Mr. Derrick, to carry American wheat. For years I have studied this question of American wheat, and at last I have arrived at a theory. Let me explain. At present, all our California wheat goes to Liverpool, and from that port is distributed over the world. But a change is coming. I am sure of it. You young men," he turned to Presley, Lyman, and Harron, "will live to see it. Our century is about done. The great word of this 19th century has been production. The great word of the 20th century will be, listen to me, you youngsters, markets. As a market for our production, or let me take a concrete example, as a market for our wheat, Europe is played out. Population in Europe is not increasing fast enough to keep up with the rapidity of our production. In some cases, as in France, the population is stationary. We, however, have gone on producing wheat at a tremendous rate. The result is overproduction. We supply more than Europe can eat, and down go the prices. The remedy is not in the curtailing of our wheat areas, but in this we must have new markets, greater markets. For years we have been sending our wheat from east to west, from California to Europe. But the time will come when we must send it from west to east. We must march with the course of empire, not against it. I mean we must look to China. Rice in China is losing its nutritive quality. The Asiatics, though, must be fed, if not on rice, then on wheat. Why, Mr. Derrick, if only 1/2 of the population of China ate a half ounce of flour per man per day, all the wheat areas in California could not feed them. If I could only hammer that into the brains of every rancher of the San Joaquin, yes, and of every owner of every bonanza farm in Dakota and Minnesota. Send your wheat to China. Handle it yourselves. Do away with the middleman. Break up the Chicago wheat pits and elevator rings and mixing houses. When, in feeding China, you have decreased the European shipments, the effect is instantaneous. Prices go up in Europe without having the least effect upon the prices in China. We hold the key. We have the wheat, infinitely more than we ourselves can eat. Asia and Europe must look to America to be fed. What fatuous neglect of opportunity to continue to deluge Europe with our surplus food when the East trembles upon the verge of starvation. The two men, Cedarquist and Magnus, continued the conversation a little further. The manufacturer's idea was new to the governor. He was greatly interested. He withdrew from the conversation. Thoughtful, he leaned back in his place, stroking the bridge of his beak-like nose with a crooked forefinger. Cedarquist turned to Heron and began asking details as to the conditions of the wheat growers of the San Joaquin. Lyman still maintained an attitude of polite aloofness, yawning occasionally behind three fingers, and Presley was left to the company of his own thoughts. There had been a day when the affairs and grievances of the farmers of his acquaintance, Magnus, Annixter, Osterman, and old Broderson, had filled him only with disgust. His mind full of a great, vague, epic poem of the West, he had kept himself apart, disdainful of what he chose to consider their petty squabbles. But the scene in Annixter's harness room had thrilled and uplifted him. He was palpitating with excitement all through the succeeding months. He abandoned the idea of an epic poem. In 6 months he had not written a single verse. Day after day he trembled with excitement as the relations between the Trust and League became more and more strained. He saw the matter in its true light. It was typical. It was the world-old war between freedom and tyranny, and at times his hatred of the railroad shook him like a crisp and withered reed, while the languid indifference of the people of the state to the quarrel filled him with a blind exasperation. But, as he had once explained to Vanamee, he must find expression. He felt that he would suffocate otherwise. He had begun to keep a journal. As the inclination spurred him, he wrote down his thoughts and ideas in this, sometimes every day, sometimes only 3 or 4 times a month. Also, he flung aside his books of poems, Milton, Tennyson, Browning, even Homer, and addressed himself to Mill, Malthus, Young, Pushkin, Henry George, Schopenhauer. He attacked the subject of social inequality with unbounded enthusiasm. He devoured rather than read, and emerged from the affair, his mind a confused jumble of conflicting notions, sick with over-effort, raging against injustice and oppression, and with not one sane suggestion as to remedy or redress. The butt of his cigarette scorched his fingers and roused him from his brooding. In the act of lighting another, he glanced across the room and was surprised to see 2 very prettily dressed young women in the company of an older gentleman in a long frock coat, standing before Hartrath's painting, examining it, their heads upon one side. Presley uttered a murmur of surprise. He himself was a member of the club, and the presence of women within its doors, except on special occasions, was not tolerated. He turned to Lyman Derrick for an explanation, but this other had also seen the women, and abruptly exclaimed, "I declare I had forgotten about it. Why, this is Ladies' Day, of course." "Why, yes," interposed Cedarquist, glancing at the women over his shoulder. "Didn't you know? They let him in twice a year, you remember, and this is a double occasion. They are going to raffle Hartrath's picture for the benefit of the gingerbread fair. Why, you are not up to date, Lyman. This is a sacred and religious rite, an important public event." Of course, murmured Lyman. He found means to survey Heron and Magnus. Certainly neither his father nor his brother was dressed for the function that impended. He had been stupid. Magnus invariably attracted attention, and now with his trousers strapped under his boots, his wrinkled frock coat, Lyman twisted his cuffs into sight with an impatient, nervous movement of his wrists, glancing a second time at his brother's pink face, forward curling yellow hair, and clothes of a country cut. But there was no help for it. He wondered what were the club regulations in the matter of bringing in visitors on Ladies' Day. "Sure enough, Ladies' Day," he remarked. "I am very glad you struck it, Governor. We can sit right where we are. I guess this is as good a place as any to see the crowd. It's a good chance to see all the big guns of the city. Do you expect your people here, Mr. Cedarquist?" "My wife may come, and my daughters," said the manufacturer. "Ah," murmured Presley, "so much the better. I was going to give myself the pleasure of calling upon your daughters, Mr. Cedarquist, this afternoon." "You can save your car fare, Press," said Cedarquist. "You will see them here." No doubt the invitations for the occasion had appointed 1 o'clock as the time, for between that hour and 2 the guests arrived in an almost unbroken stream. From their point of vantage in the round window of the main room, Magnus, his 2 sons, and Presley looked on very interested. Cedarquist had excused himself, affirming that he must look out for his womenfolk. Of every 10 of the arrivals, 7 at least were ladies. They entered the room, this unfamiliar masculine haunt where their husbands, brothers, and sons spent so much of their time, with a certain show of hesitancy and little nervous oblique glances, moving their heads from side to side like a file of hens venturing into a strange barn. They came in groups, ushered by a single member of the club, doing the honors with effusive bows and polite gestures, indicating the various objects of interest, pictures, busts, and the like, that decorated the room. Fresh from his recollections of Bonneville, Guadalajara, and the dance in Annixter's barn, Presley was astonished at the beauty of these women and the elegance of their toilets. The crowd thickened rapidly. A murmur of conversation arose, subdued, gracious, mingled with the soft rustle of silk, grenadines, velvet. The scent of delicate perfumes spread in the air, violet de Parme, peau d'Espagne. Colors of the most harmonious blends appeared and disappeared at intervals in the slowly moving press, touches of lavender-tinted velvets, pale violet crepes, and cream-colored appliqued laces. There seemed to be no need of introductions. Everybody appeared to be acquainted. There was no awkwardness, no constraint. The assembly disengaged an impression of refined pleasure. On every hand, innumerable dialogues seemed to go forward, easily and naturally, without break or interruption. Witty, engaging, the couple never at a loss for repartee. A third party was gracefully included, then a fourth. Little groups were formed, groups that divided themselves, or melted into other groups, or disintegrated again into isolated pairs, or lost themselves in the background of the mass, all without friction, without embarrassment, the whole affair going forward of itself, decorous, tactful, well-bred. At a distance, and not too loud, a stringed orchestra sent up a pleasing hum. Waiters with brass buttons on their full-dress coats went from group to group, silent, unobtrusive, serving salads and ices. But the focus of the assembly was the little space before Hartrath's painting. It was called A Study of the Contra Costa Foothills, and was set in a frame of natural redwood, the bark still adhering. It was conspicuously displayed on an easel at the right of the entrance to the main room of the club, and was very large. In the foreground, and to the left, under the shade of a live oak, stood a couple of reddish cows, knee-deep in a patch of yellow poppies, while in the right-hand corner, to balance the composition, was placed a girl in a pink dress and white sunbonnet, in which the shadows were indicated by broad dashes of pale blue paint. The ladies and young girls examined the production with little murmurs of admiration, hazarding remembered phrases, searching for the exact balance between generous praise and critical discrimination, expressing their opinions in the mild technicalities of the art books and painting classes. They spoke of atmospheric effects, of middle distance, of chiaro-oscuro, of foreshortening, of the decomposition of light, of the subordination of individuality to fidelity of interpretation. One tall girl, with hair almost white in its blondness, having observed that the handling of the masses reminded her strongly of Corot, her companion, who carried a gold lorgnette by a chain around her neck, answered, "Ah, Millet, perhaps, but not Corot." This verdict had an immediate success. It was passed from group to group. It seemed to imply a delicate distinction that carried conviction at once. It was decided formally that the reddish-brown cows in the picture were reminiscent of Daubigny, and that the handling of the masses was altogether Millet, but that the general effect was not quite Corot. Presley, curious to see the painting that was the subject of so much discussion, had left the group in the round window and stood close by Hartrath, craning his head over the shoulders of the crowd, trying to catch a glimpse of the reddish cows, the milkmaid, and the blue-painted foothills. He was suddenly aware of Cedarquist's voice in his ear, and, turning about, found himself face to face with the manufacturer, his wife, and his 2 daughters. There was a meeting. Salutations were exchanged, Presley shaking hands all around, expressing his delight at seeing his old friends once more, for he had known the family from his boyhood, Mrs. Cedarquist being his aunt. Mrs. Cedarquist and her 2 daughters declared that the air of Los Muertos must certainly have done him a world of good. He was stouter, there could be no doubt of it. A little pale, perhaps. He was fatiguing himself with his writing, no doubt. Ah, he must take care. Health was everything, after all. Had he been writing any more verse? Every month they scanned the magazines looking for his name. Mrs. Cedarquist was a fashionable woman, the president or chairman of a score of clubs. She was forever running after fads, appearing continually in the society wherein she moved with new and astounding protégés, fakirs whom she unearthed no one knew where, discovering them long in advance of her companions. Now it was a Russian countess with dirty fingernails who traveled throughout America and borrowed money. Now an aesthete who possessed a wonderful collection of topaz gems, who submitted decorative schemes for the interior arrangement of houses, and who received at Mrs. Cedarquist's drawing-rooms dressed in a white velvet cassock. Now a widow of some Mohammedan, of Bengal or Rajputana, who had a blue spot in the middle of her forehead, and who solicited contributions for her sisters in affliction. Now a certain bearded poet, recently back from the Klondike. Now a decayed musician who had been ejected from a young ladies' musical conservatory of Europe because of certain surprising pamphlets on free love, and who had come to San Francisco to introduce the community to the music of Brahms. Now a Japanese youth who wore spectacles and a gray flannel shirt, and who at intervals delivered himself of the most astonishing poems. Vague, unrhymed, unmetrical lucubrations, incoherent, bizarre. Now a Christian Scientist, a lean, gray woman whose creed was neither Christian nor scientific. Now a university professor with the bristling beard of an anarchist chief of section, and a roaring, guttural voice whose intenseness left him gasping and apoplectic. Now a civilized Cherokee with a mission. Now a female elocutionist whose forte was Byron's songs of Greece. Now a high-caste Chinaman. Now a miniature painter. Now a tenor, a pianist, a mandolin player, a missionary, a drawing master, a virtuoso, a collector, an Armenian, a botanist with a new flower, a critic with a new theory, a doctor with a new treatment. And all these people had a veritable mania for declamation and fancy dress. The Russian countess gave talks on the prisons of Siberia, wearing the headdress and pinchbeck ornaments of a Slav bride. The aesthete, in his white cassock, gave readings on obscure questions of art and ethics. The widow of India, in the costume of her caste, described the social life of her people at home. The bearded poet, perspiring in furs and boots of reindeer skin, declaimed verses of his own composition about the wild life of the Alaskan mining camps. The Japanese youth, in the silk robes of the samurai two-sworded nobles, read from his own works. The flat-bordered earth nailed down at night, rusting under the darkness. The brave, upright rains that came down like errands from iron-bodied yore time. The Christian Scientist, in funereal, impressive black, discussed the contra-will and panpsychic hylozoism. The university professor put on a full dress suit and lisle thread gloves at 3 in the afternoon, and before literary clubs and circles bellowed extracts from Goethe and Schiller in the German, shaking his fists purple with vehemence. The Cherokee, arrayed in fringed buckskin and blue beads, rented from a costumer, intoned folk songs of his people in the vernacular. The elocutionist, in cheesecloth toga and tin bracelets, rendered, "The Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung." He paused again, dreaming, lost in a reverie, then, just above a whisper, murmured, "That which thou sowest is not quickened except it die." And she, Anale, died. "You could not have been mistaken," said Presley. "You were sure that there was something? Imagination can do so much, and the influence of the surroundings was strong. How impossible it would be that anything should happen. And you say you heard nothing, saw nothing?" "I believe," answered Vanamee, "in a sixth sense, or rather a whole system of other unnamed senses beyond the reach of our understanding. People who live much alone and close to nature experience the sensation of it. Perhaps it is something fundamental that we share with plants and animals. The same thing that sends the birds south long before the first colds, the same thing that makes the grain of wheat struggle up to meet the sun. And this sense never deceives. You may see wrong, hear wrong, but once touch this sixth sense, and it acts with absolute fidelity, you are certain. No, I hear nothing in the mission garden. I see nothing. Nothing touches me. But I am certain for all that." Presley hesitated for a moment. Then he asked, "Shall you go back to the garden again, make the test again?" "I don't know." "Strange enough," commented Presley, wondering. Vanamee sank back in his chair, his eyes growing vacant again. "Strange enough," he murmured. There was a long silence. Neither spoke nor moved. There in that moribund ancient town, wrapped in its siesta, flagellated with heat, deserted, ignored, baking in a noonday silence, these two strange men, the one a poet by nature, the other by training, both out of tune with their world, dreamers, introspective, morbid, lost and unfamiliar at that end-of-the-century time, searching for a sign, groping and baffled amidst the perplexing obscurity of the delusion, sat over empty wine-glasses, silent with the pervading silence that surrounded them, hearing only the cooing of doves and the drone of bees, the quiet so profound that at length they could plainly distinguish at intervals the puffing and coughing of a locomotive switching cars in the station-yard of Bonneville. It was, no doubt, this jarring sound that at length roused Presley from his lethargy. The two friends rose. Solotari very sleepily came forward. They paid for the luncheon, and stepping out into the heat and glare of the streets of the town, passed on through it and took the road that led northward across a corner of Dyke's hop fields. They were bound for the hills in the northeastern corner of Quien-Sabe. It was the same walk which Presley had taken on the previous occasion when he had first met Vanamee herding the sheep. This encompassing detour around the whole countryside was a favorite pastime of his, and he was anxious that Vanamee should share his pleasure in it. But soon after leaving Guadalajara, they found themselves upon the land that Dyke had bought, and upon which he was to raise his famous crop of hops. Dyke's house was close at hand, a very pleasant little cottage, painted white, with green blinds and deep porches, while near it, and yet in process of construction, were two great storehouses and a drying and curing house, where the hops were to be stored and treated. All about were evidences that the former engineer had already been hard at work. The ground had been put in readiness to receive the crop, and a bewildering, innumerable multitude of poles, connected with a maze of wire and twine, had been set out. Farther on, at a turn of the road, they came upon Dyke himself, driving a farm wagon loaded with more poles. He was in his shirt-sleeves, his massive, hairy arms bare to the elbow, glistening with sweat, red with heat. In his bell-like, rumbling voice he was calling to his foreman and a boy at work in stringing the poles together. At the sight of Presley and Vanamee he hailed them jovially, addressing them as boys, and insisting that they should get into the wagon with him and drive to the house for a glass of beer. His mother had only the day before returned from Marysville, where she had been looking up a seminary for the little Tad. She would be delighted to see the two boys. Besides, Vanamee must see how the little Tad had grown since he last set eyes on her. Wouldn't know her for the same little girl. And the beer had been on ice since morning. Presley and Vanamee could not well refuse. They climbed into the wagon and jolted over the uneven ground, through the bare forest of hop poles to the house. Inside they found Mrs. Dyke, an old lady with a very gentle face, who wore a cap and a very old-fashioned gown with hoop skirts, dusting the whatnot in a corner of the parlor. The two men were presented, and the beer was had from off the ice. "Mother," said Dyke, as he wiped the froth from his great blond beard, "ain't Sid anywheres about? I want Mr. Vanamy to see how she has grown. Smartest little tad in Tulare County, boys, and recites the whole of Snowbound end to end without skipping or looking at the book. Maybe you don't believe that. Mother, ain't I right? Without skipping a line, hey?" Mrs. Dyke nodded to say that it was so, but explained that Sidney was in Guadalajara. In putting on her new slippers for the first time the morning before, she had found a dime in the toe of one of them, and had had the whole house by the ears ever since till she could spend it. "Was it for licorice, to make her licorice water?" inquired Dyke gravely. "Yes," said Mrs. Dyke. "I made her tell me what she was going to get before she went, and it was licorice." Dyke, though his mother protested that he was foolish and that Presley and Vanamy had no great interest in young ones, insisted upon showing the visitors Sidney's copybooks. They were monuments of laborious, elaborate neatness, the trite moralities and ready-made aphorisms of the philanthropists and publicists repeated from page to page with wearying insistence. "I, too, am an American citizen, S.D. As the twig is bent, the tree is inclined. Truth, crushed to earth, will rise again. As for me, give me liberty or give me death." And last of all, a strange intrusion amongst the mild, well-worn phrases, two legends. "My motto, public control of public franchises," and "The P&SW is an enemy of the state." "I see," commented Presley, "you mean the little tad to understand the situation early." "I told him he was foolish to give that to Sid to copy," said Mrs. Dyke, with indulgent remonstrance. "What can she understand of public franchises?" "Never mind," observed Dyke. "She'll remember it when she grows up, and when the seminary people have rubbed her up a bit, and then she'll begin to ask questions and understand. And don't you make any mistake, Mother," he went on, "about the little tad not knowing who her dad's enemies are. What do you think, boys? Listen here. Precious little I've ever told her of the railroad or how I was turned off. But the other day I was working down by the fence next the railroad tracks, and Sid was there. She'd brought her doll rags down, and she was playing house behind a pile of hop poles. Well, along comes a through freight, mixed train from Missouri points and a string of empties from New Orleans, and when it had passed, what do you suppose the tad did? She didn't know I was watching her. She goes to the fence and spits a little spit after the caboose, and puts out her little head and, if you'll believe me, hisses at the train. And Mother says she does that same every time she sees a train go by, and never crosses the tracks that she don't spit her little spit on 'em. What do you think of that?" "But I correct her every time," protested Mrs. Dyke seriously. "Where she picked up the trick of hissing, I don't know. No, it's not funny. It seems dreadful to see a little girl who's as sweet and gentle as can be in every other way so venomous. She says the other little girls at school, and the boys too, are all the same way. Oh dear," she sighed, "why will the general office be so unkind and unjust? Why, I couldn't be happy with all the money in the world if I thought that even one little child hated me so that it would spit and hiss at me. And it's not one child, it's all of them, so Sidney says. And think of all the grown people who hate the road, women and men, the whole county, the whole state, thousands and thousands of people. Don't the managers and the directors of the road ever think of that? Don't they ever think of all the hate that surrounds them, everywhere, and the good people that just grit their teeth when the name of the road is mentioned? Why do they want to make the people hate them?" "No," she murmured, the tears starting to her eyes. "No, I tell you, Mr. Presley, the men who own the railroad are wicked, bad-hearted men who don't care how much the poor people suffer, so long as the road makes its $18 million a year. They don't care whether the people hate them or love them, just so long as they are afraid of them. It's not right, and God will punish them sooner or later." A little after this, the two young men took themselves away. Dyke obligingly carrying them in the wagon as far as the gate that opened onto the Quien ranch. On the way, Presley referred to what Mrs. Dyke had said, and led Dyke himself to speak of the P&SW. "Well," Dyke said, "it's like this, Mr. Presley. I personally haven't got the right to kick. With you wheat-growing people, I guess it's different, but hops, you see, don't count for much in the state. It's such a little business that the road don't want to bother themselves to tax it. It's the wheat growers that the road cinches. The rates on hops are fair. I've got to admit that. I was into Bonneville a while ago to find out. It's 2 cents a pound, and, Lord love you, that's reasonable enough to suit any man. No," he concluded, "I'm on the way to make money now. The road sacking me as they did was, maybe, a good thing for me after all. It came just at the right time. I had a bit of money put by, and here was the chance to go into hops with the certainty that hops would quadruple and quintuple in price inside the year. No, it was my chance, and though they didn't mean it by a long chalk, the railroad people did me a good turn when they gave me my time, and the tad'll enter the seminary next fall." About a quarter of an hour after they had said good-bye to the one-time engineer, Presley and Vanamee, tramping briskly along the road that led northward through Quien arrived at Annixter's ranch house. At once they were aware of a vast and unwonted bustle that revolved about the place. They stopped a few moments looking on, amused and interested in what was going forward. The colossal barn was finished. Its freshly whitewashed sides glared intolerably in the sun, but its interior was as yet innocent of paint, and through the yawning vent of the sliding doors came a delicious odor of new, fresh wood and shavings. A crowd of men, Annixter's farm hands, were swarming all about it. Some were balanced on the topmost rounds of ladders, hanging festoons of Japanese lanterns from tree to tree, and all across the front of the barn itself. Mrs. Tree, her daughter Hilma, and another woman were inside the barn, cutting into long strips bolt after bolt of red, white, and blue cambric, and directing how these strips should be draped from the ceiling and on the walls. Everywhere resounded the tapping of tack hammers. A farm wagon drove up loaded to overflowing with evergreens and with great bundles of palm leaves, and these were immediately seized upon and affixed as supplementary decorations to the tricolored cambric upon the inside walls of the barn. 2 of the larger evergreen trees were placed on either side of the barn door, and their tops bent over to form an arch. In the middle of this arch it was proposed to hang a mammoth pasteboard escutcheon with gold letters spelling the word "Welcome." Piles of chairs, rented from IOOF Hall in Bonneville, heaped themselves in an apparently hopeless entanglement on the ground, while at the far extremity of the barn a couple of carpenters clattered about the impromptu staging which was to accommodate the band. There was a strenuous gaiety in the air. Everybody was in the best of spirits. Notes of laughter continually interrupted the conversation on every hand. At every moment a group of men involved themselves in uproarious horseplay. They passed oblique jokes behind their hands to each other, grossly veiled double meanings meant for the women, and bellowed with laughter thereat, stamping on the ground. The relations between the sexes grew more intimate, the women and girls pushing the young fellows away from their sides with vigorous thrusts of their elbows. It was passed from group to group that Adela Vaca, a division superintendent's wife, had lost her garter. The daughter of the foreman of the home ranch was kissed behind the door of the dairy house. Annixter, in execrable temper, appeared from time to time, hatless, his stiff yellow hair in wild disorder. He hurried between the barn and the ranch house, carrying now a wicker demijohn, now a case of wine, now a basket of lemons and pineapples. Besides general supervision, he had elected to assume the responsibility of composing the punch, something stiff, by jingo, a punch that would raise you right out of your boots, a regular hair-lifter. The harness room of the barn he had set apart for himself and intimates. He had brought a long table down from the house, and upon it had set out boxes of cigars, bottles of whiskey and of beer, and the great china bowls for the punch. It would be no fault of his, he declared, if half the number of his men friends were not uproarious before they left. His barn dance would be the talk of all Tulare County for years to come. For this one day he had resolved to put all thoughts of business out of his head. For the matter of that, things were going well enough. Osterman was back from Los Angeles with a favorable report as to his affair with Disbrow and Darrell. There had been another meeting of the committee. Aaron Derrick had attended. Though he had taken no part in the discussion, Annixter was satisfied. The governor had consented to allow Harron to come in if he so desired, and Harron had pledged himself to share 1/6 of the campaign expenses, providing these did not exceed a certain figure. As Annixter came to the door of the barn to shout abuse at the distraught Chinese cook who was cutting up lemons in the kitchen, he caught sight of Presley and Vanamee and hailed them. "Hello, Press," he called. "Come over here and see how she looks." He indicated the barn with a movement of his head. "Well, we're getting ready for you tonight," he went on as the two friends came up. "But how we are going to get straightened out by 8 o'clock, I don't know. Would you believe that Pip Caraher is short of lemons at this last minute, and I told him I'd want 3 cases of 'em as much as a month ago. And here, just when I want a good lively saddle horse to get around on, somebody hikes the buckskin out of the corral. Stole her, by jingo. I'll have the law on that thief if it breaks me. And a $60 saddle and headstall gone with her. And only about half the number of Jap lanterns that I ordered have shown up, and not candles enough for those. It's enough to make a dog sick. There's nothing done that you don't do yourself unless you stand over these loafers with a club. I'm sick of the whole business, and I've lost my hat. Wish to God I'd never dreamed of giving this rotten fool dance. Clutter the whole place up with a lot of females. I sure did lose my presence of mind when I got that idea." Then, ignoring the fact that it was he himself who had called the young men to him, he added, "Well, this is my busy day. Sorry I can't stop and talk to you longer." He shouted a last imprecation at the Chinaman and turned back into the barn. Presley and Vanamee went on, but Annixter, as he crossed the floor of the barn, all but collided with Hilma Tree, who came out from one of the stalls, a box of candles in her arms. Gasping out an apology, Annixter re-entered the harness room, closing the door behind him, and, forgetting all the responsibility of the moment, lit a cigar and sat down in one of the hired chairs, his hands in his pockets, his feet on the table, frowning thoughtfully through the blue smoke. Annixter was at last driven to confess to himself that he could not get the thought of Hilma Tree out of his mind. Finally she had got a hold on him. The thing that of all others he most dreaded had happened. A female girl had got a hold on him, and now there was no longer for him any such thing as peace of mind. The idea of the young woman was with him continually. He went to bed with it. He got up with it. At every moment of the day he was pestered with it. It interfered with his work, got mixed up in his business. What a miserable confession for a man to make, a fine way to waste his time. Was it possible that only the other day he had stood in front of the music store in Bonneville and seriously considered making Hilma a present of a music box? Even now the very thought of it made him flush with shame, and this after she had told him plainly that she did not like him. He was running after her, he, Annixter. He ripped out a furious oath, striking the table with his boot heel. Again and again he had resolved to put the whole affair from out his mind. Once he had been able to do so, but of late it was becoming harder and harder with every successive day. He had only to close his eyes to see her as plain as if she stood before him. He saw her in the glory of sunlight that set a fine tinted luster of pale carnation and gold on the silken sheen of her white skin. Her hair sparkled with it. Her thick, strong neck, sloping to her shoulders with beautiful full curves, seemed to radiate the light. Her eyes, brown, wide, innocent in expression, disclosing the full disk of the pupil upon the slightest provocation, flashed in this sunlight like diamonds. Annixter was all bewildered. With the exception of the timid little creature in the glove-cleaning establishment in Sacramento, he had had no acquaintance with any woman. His world was harsh, crude, a world of men only, men who were to be combated, opposed. His hand was against nearly every one of them. Women he distrusted with the instinctive distrust of the overgrown schoolboy. Now, at length, a young woman had come into his life. Promptly he was struck with discomfiture, annoyed almost beyond endurance. harassed, bedeviled, excited, made angry, and exasperated. He was suspicious of the woman, yet desired her, totally ignorant of how to approach her, hating the sex, yet drawn to the individual, confusing the two emotions, sometimes even hating Hilma as a result of this confusion, but at all times disturbed, vexed, irritated beyond power of expression. At length Annixter cast his cigar from him and plunged again into the work of the day. The afternoon wore to evening, to the accompaniment of wearying and clamorous endeavor. In some unexplained fashion, the labor of putting the great barn in readiness for the dance was accomplished. The last bolt of cambric was hung in place from the rafters. The last evergreen tree was nailed to the joists of the walls. The last lantern hung, the last nail driven into the musician's platform. The sun set. There was a great scurry to have supper and dress. Annixter, last of all the other workers, left the barn in the dusk of twilight. He was alone. He had a saw under one arm, a bag of tools was in his hand. He was in his shirt-sleeves and carried his coat over his shoulder. A hammer was thrust into one of his hip pockets. He was in execrable temper. The day's work had fagged him out. He had not been able to find his hat. "And the buckskin with $60 worth of saddle gone, too," he groaned. "Oh, ain't it sweet?" At his house, Mrs. Tree had set out a cold supper for him, the inevitable dish of prunes serving as dessert. After supper, Annixter bathed and dressed. He decided at the last moment to wear his usual town-going suit, a sack suit of black made by a Bonneville tailor. But his hat was gone. There were other hats he might have worn, but because this particular one was lost, he fretted about it all through his dressing, and then decided to have one more look around the barn for it. For over a quarter of an hour he pottered about the barn, going from stall to stall, rummaging the harness-room and feed-room, all to no purpose. At last he came out again upon the main floor, definitely giving up the search, looking about him to see if everything was in order. The festoons of Japanese lanterns in and around the barn were not yet lighted, but some half-dozen lamps with great tin reflectors that hung against the walls were burning low. A dull half-light pervaded the vast interior, hollow, echoing, leaving the corners and roof thick with impenetrable black shadows. The barn faced the west, and through the open sliding doors was streaming a single bright bar from the afterglow, incongruous and out of all harmony with the dull flare of the kerosene lamps. As Annixter glanced about him, he saw a figure step briskly out of the shadows of one corner of the building, pause for the fraction of one instant in the bar of light, then at the sight of him dart back again. There was a sound of hurried footsteps. Annixter, with recollections of the stolen buckskin in his mind, cried out sharply, "Who's there?" There was no answer. In a second his pistol was in his hand. "Who's there? Quick, speak up, or I'll shoot." "No, don't shoot," cried an answering voice. "Oh, be careful. It's I, Hilma Tree." Annixter slid the pistol into his pocket with a great qualm of apprehension. He came forward and met Hilma in the doorway. "Good Lord," he murmured, "that sure did give me a start. If I had shot—" Hilma stood abashed and confused before him. She was dressed in a white organdy frock of the most rigorous simplicity, and wore neither flower nor ornament. The severity of her dress made her look even larger than usual, and even as it was her eyes were on a level with Annixter's. There was a certain fascination in the contradiction of stature and character of Hilma. A great girl, half child as yet, but tall as a man for all that. There was a moment's awkward silence. Then Hilma explained, I came back to look for my hat. I thought I left it here this afternoon." "And I was looking for my hat," cried Annixter. "Funny enough, eh?" They laughed at this as heartily as children might have done. The constraint of the situation was a little relaxed, and Annixter, with sudden directness, glanced sharply at the young woman and demanded, "Well, Miss Hilma, hate me as much as ever?" "Oh, no, sir," she answered. "I never said I hated you." "Well, dislike me, then. I know you said that." I disliked what you did, tried to do. It made me angry, and it hurt me. I shouldn't have said what I did that time, but it was your fault." "You mean you shouldn't have said you didn't like me?" asked Annixter. "Why?" Well, I don't dislike anybody, admitted Hilma. Then I can take it that you don't dislike me, is that it? I don't dislike anybody, persisted Hilma. Well, I asked you more than that, didn't I? Queried Annixter uneasily. I asked you to like me, remember, the other day? I'm asking you that again now. I want you to like me. Hilma lifted her eyes inquiringly to his. In her words was an unmistakable ring of absolute sincerity. Innocently she inquired, "Why?" Annixter was struck speechless. In the face of such candor, such perfect ingenuousness, he was at a loss for any words. Well, he stammered. Well, I don't know, he suddenly burst out. That is, he went on, groping for his wits, I can't quite say why. The idea of a colossal lie occurred to him, a thing actually royal. I like to have the people who are around me like me, he declared. I like to be popular, understand? Yes, that's it, he continued, more reassured. I don't like the idea of anyone disliking me. That's the way I am. It's my nature. Oh, then, returned Hilma, you needn't bother. No, I don't dislike you. Well, that's good, declared Annixter judicially. That's good. But hold on, he interrupted. I'm forgetting. It's not enough to not dislike me. I want you to like me. How about that? Hilma paused for a moment, glancing vaguely out of the doorway toward the lighted window of the dairy house, her head tilted. I don't know that I ever thought about that, she said. Well, think about it now, insisted Annixter. But I never thought about liking anybody particularly, she observed. It's because I like everybody, don't you see? Well, you've got to like some people more than other people, hazarded Annixter, and I want to be one of those some people, savvy? Good Lord, I don't know how to say these fool things. I talk like a galoot when I get talking to female girls, and I can't lay my tongue to anything that sounds right. It isn't my nature. And look here, I lied when I said I like to have people like me, to be popular. Rot! I don't care a curse about people's opinions of me. But there's a few people that are more to me than most others. That chap Presley, for instance, and those people I do want to have like me. What they think counts. Sure, I know I've got enemies, piles of them. I could name you half a dozen men right now that are naturally itching to take a shot at me. How about this ranch? Don't I know? Can't I hear the men growling oaths under their breath after I've gone by? And in business ways, too, he went on, speaking half to himself. In Bonneville and all over the county, there's not a man of them wouldn't howl for joy if they got a chance to down Buck Annixter. Think I care? Why, I like it. I run my ranch to suit myself, and I play my game my own way. I'm a driver, I know it, and a bully, too. Oh, I know what they call me, a brute beast with a twist in my temper that would rile up a newborn lamb, and I'm crusty and pig-headed and obstinate. They say all that, but they've got to say, too, that I'm cleverer than any man jack in the running. There's nobody can get ahead of me. His eyes snapped. Let 'em grind their teeth. They can't down me. When I shut my fist, there's not one of them can open it. No, not with a chisel. He turned to Hilma again. Well, when a man's hated as much as that, it stands to reason, don't it, Miss Hilma, that the few friends he has got he wants to keep. I'm not such an entire swine to the people that know me best. That jackass Presley, for instance. I'd put my hand in the fire to do him a real service. Sometimes I get kind of lonesome. Wonder if you would understand. It's my fault, but there's not a horse about the place that don't lay his ears back when I get on him. There's not a dog don't put his tail between his legs as soon as I come near him. The cayuse isn't foaled yet here on Quien-Sabe that can throw me, nor the dog whelp that would dare show his teeth at me. I kick that Irish setter every time I see him. But wonder what I'd do, though, if he didn't slink so much, if he wagged his tail and was glad to see me. So it all comes to this. I'd like to have you, well, sort of feel that I was a good friend of yours and like me because of it. The flame in the lamp on the wall in front of Hilma stretched upward, tall and thin, and began to smoke. She went over to where the lamp hung, and standing on tiptoe, lowered the wick. As she reached her hand up, Annixter noted how the sombre, lurid red of the lamp made a warm reflection on her smooth, round arm. "Do you understand?" he queried. "Yes, why, yes," she answered, turning around. "It's very good of you to want to be a friend of mine. I didn't think so, though, when you tried to kiss me. But maybe it's all right since you've explained things. You see, I'm different from you. I like everybody to like me, and I like to like everybody. It makes one so much happier. You wouldn't believe it, but you ought to try it, sir, just to see. It's so good to be good to people, and to have people good to you. And everybody has always been so good to me. Mama and Papa, of course, and Billy the stableman, and Montalegre the Portuguese foreman, and the Chinese cook, even, and Mr. Delaney, only he went away, and Mrs. Vaca and her little—" "Delaney, eh?" demanded Annixter abruptly. "You and he were pretty good friends, were you?" "Oh, yes," she answered. "He was just as good to me." Every day in the summer-time he used to ride over to the seed ranch back of the mission and bring me a great armful of flowers, the prettiest things, and I used to pretend to pay him for them with dollars made of cheese that I cut out of the cheese with a biscuit cutter. It was such fun. We were the best of friends. "There's another lamp smoking," growled Annixter. "Turn it down, will you? And see that somebody sweeps this floor here. It's all littered up with pine needles. I've got a lot to do. Goodbye." "Goodbye, sir." Annixter returned to the ranch house, his teeth clenched, enraged, his face flushed. "Ah," he muttered, "Delaney, hey? Throwing it up to me that I fired him." His teeth gripped together more fiercely than ever. "The best of friends, eh? By God, I'll have that girl yet. I'll show that cowpuncher. Ain't I her employer, her boss? I'll show her, and Delaney, too. It would be easy enough, and then Delaney can have her, if he wants her, after me." An evil light flashing from under his scowl spread over his face. The male instincts of possession, unreasoned, treacherous, oblique, came twisting to the surface. All the lower nature of the man, ignorant of women, racked at one and the same time with enmity and desire, roused itself like a hideous and abominable beast. And at the same moment Hilma returned to her house, humming to herself as she walked, her white dress glowing with a shimmer of faint saffron light in the last ray of the afterglow. A little after 7:30, the first carryall bearing the druggist of Bonneville and his womenfolk arrived in front of the new barn. Immediately afterward, an express wagon loaded down with a swarming family of Spanish Mexicans, gorgeous in red and yellow colors, followed. Billy, the stableman, and his assistant took charge of the teams, unchecking the horses and hitching them to a fence back of the barn. Then Caraher, the saloon-keeper, in derby hat, Prince Albert coat, pointed yellow shoes, and inevitable red necktie, drove into the yard on his buckboard, the delayed box of lemons under the seat. It looked as if the whole array of invited guests was to arrive in one unbroken procession, but for a long half-hour nobody else appeared. Annixter and Caraher withdrew to the harness-room and promptly involved themselves in a wrangle as to the make-up of the famous punch. From time to time their voices could be heard, uplifted in clamorous argument. 2 quarts and a half, and a cupful of chartreuse. Rot, rot, I know better. Champagne straight, and a dash of brandy. The druggist's wife and sister retired to the feed-room, where a bureau with a swinging mirror had been placed for the convenience of the women. The druggist stood awkwardly outside the door of the feed-room, his coat-collar turned up against the drafts that drifted through the barn, his face troubled, debating anxiously as to the propriety of putting on his gloves. The Spanish-Mexican family, a father, mother, and 5 children and sister-in-law, sat rigid on the edges of the hired chairs, silent, constrained, their eyes lowered, their elbows in at their sides, glancing furtively from under their eyebrows at the decorations, or watching with intense absorption young Vaca, son of one of the division superintendents, who wore a checked coat and white thread gloves, and who paced up and down the length of the barn, frowning, very important, whittling a wax candle over the floor to make it slippery for dancing. The musicians arrived, the city band of Bonneville, Annixter having managed to offend the leader of the Dirigo Club Orchestra at the very last moment to such a point that he had refused his services. These members of the city band repaired at once to their platform in the corner. At every instant they laughed uproariously among themselves, joshing one of their number, a Frenchman whom they called Skeezicks. Their hilarity reverberated in a hollow metallic roll among the rafters overhead. The druggist observed to young Vaca as he passed by that he thought them pretty fresh, just the same. "I'm busy, I'm very busy," returned the young man, continuing on his way, still frowning and paring the stump of candle. 2 quarts and a half. 2 quarts and a half. Ah, yes, in a way that's so, and then again, in a way it isn't. I know better. All along one side of the barn were a row of stalls, 14 of them, clean as yet, redolent of new-cut wood, the sawdust still in the cracks of the flooring. Deliberately the druggist went from one to the other, pausing contemplatively before each. He returned down the line, and again took up his position by the door of the feed-room, nodding his head judicially, as if satisfied. He decided to put on his gloves. By now it was quite dark. Outside, between the barn and the ranch houses, one could see a group of men on step-ladders lighting the festoons of Japanese lanterns. In the darkness only their faces appeared here and there, high above the ground, seen in a haze of red, strange, grotesque. Gradually, as the multitude of lanterns were lit, the light spread. The grass underfoot looked like green excelsior. Another group of men invaded the barn itself, lighting the lamps and lanterns there. Soon the whole place was gleaming with points of light. Young Vaca, who had disappeared, returned with his pockets full of wax candles. He resumed his whittling, refusing to answer any questions, vociferating that he was busy. Outside there was a sound of hoofs and voices. More guests had arrived. The druggist, seized with confusion, terrified lest he had put on his gloves too soon, thrust his hands into his pockets. It was Cutter, Magnus Derrick's division superintendent, who came, bringing his wife and her 2 girl cousins. They had come 15 miles by the trail from the far-distant division house on 4 of Los Muertos, and had ridden on horseback instead of driving. Mrs. Cutter could be heard declaring that she was nearly dead, and felt more like going to bed than dancing. The 2 girl cousins, in dresses of dotted Swiss over blue sateen, were doing their utmost to pacify her. She could be heard protesting from moment to moment. One distinguished the phrases, "straight to my bed," "back nearly broken in 2, "never wanted to come in the first place." The druggist, observing Cutter take a pair of gloves from Mrs. Cutter's reticule, drew his hands from his pockets. But abruptly there was an interruption. In the musicians' corner a scuffle broke out. A chair was overturned. There was a noise of imprecations mingled with shouts of derision. Skeezicks, the Frenchman, had turned upon the joshers. "Ah, no," he was heard to exclaim. "At the end of the end is too much. Kind of a bad canary. We will go to see about that. Aha! Let him close up his face before I demolish it with a good stroke of the fist." The men who were lighting the lanterns were obliged to intervene before he could be placated. Hooven and his wife and daughters arrived. Minna was carrying little Hilda, already asleep, in her arms. Minna looked very pretty, striking even, with her black hair, pale face, very red lips, and greenish-blue eyes. She was dressed in what had been Mrs. Hooven's wedding gown, a cheap affair of farmer's satin. Mrs. Hooven had pendant earrings of imitation jet in her ears. Hooven was wearing an old frock coat of Magnus Derrick's, the sleeves too long, the shoulders absurdly too wide. He and Cutter at once entered into an excited conversation as to the ownership of a certain steer. "Why, the brand—" "Ach Gott, der Brand!" Hooven clasped his head. "Ach, der Brand! Doc makes me laugh some laughs. That's good, der Brand. Don't I see him? Sure, der Bull mit der black star by der forehead in der Mittelof. Any someones you ask tell you dat is mine Bull. You ask any someones. Der Brand, to hell mit der Brand. You ain't got some memories about dis thing, I guess not." "Please step aside, gentlemen," said young Vaca, who was still making the rounds of the floor. Hooven whirled about. "Eh, what then?" he exclaimed, still excited, willing to be angry at anyone for the moment. "Don't you push so, you. I think perhaps you don't own those barn here." "I'm busy. I'm very busy." The young man pushed by with grave preoccupation. 2 quarts and a half. 2 quarts and a half. "I know better. That's all rot." But the barn was filling up rapidly. At every moment there was a rattle of a newly arrived vehicle from outside. Guest after guest appeared in the doorway, singly or in couples, or in families, or in garrulous parties of 5 and 6. Now it was Phelps and his mother from Los Muertos. Now a foreman from Broderson's with his family. Now a gaily apparelled clerk from a Bonneville store, solitary and bewildered, looking for a place to put his hat. Now a couple of Spanish-Mexican girls from Guadalajara, with coquettish effects of black and yellow about their dress. Now a group of Osterman's tenants, Portuguese, swarthy, with plastered hair and curled moustaches, redolent of cheap perfumes. Soria arrived, his smooth, shiny face glistening with perspiration. He wore a new cassock and carried his broad-brimmed hat under his arm. His appearance made quite a stir. He passed from group to group, urbane, affable, shaking hands right and left. He assumed a set smile of amiability which never left his face the whole evening. But abruptly there was a veritable sensation. From out the little crowd that persistently huddled about the doorway came Osterman. He wore a dress suit with a white waistcoat and patent leather pumps. What a wonder! A little calm of excitement spread around the barn. One exchanged nudges of the elbow with one's neighbor, whispering earnestly behind the hand. What astonishing clothes! Catch on to the coat-tails. It was a masquerade costume, maybe. That goat Osterman was such a josher, one could never tell what he would do next. The musicians began to tune up. From their corner came a medley of mellow sounds, the subdued chirps of the violins, the dull bourdon of the bass viol, the liquid gurgling of the flageolet, and the deep-toned snarl of the big horn, with now and then a rasping stridulating of the snare drum. A sense of gaiety began to spread throughout the assembly. At every moment the crowd increased. The aroma of new-sawn timber and sawdust began to be mingled with the feminine odor of sachet and flowers. There was a babble of talk in the air, male baritone and soprano chatter, varied by an occasional note of laughter and the swish of stiffly starched petticoats. On the row of chairs that went around 3 sides of the wall, groups began to settle themselves. For a long time the guests huddled close to the doorway. The lower end of the floor was crowded, the upper end deserted. But by degrees the lines of white muslin and pink and blue sateen extended, dotted with the darker figures of men in black suits. The conversation grew louder as the timidity of the early moments wore off. Groups at a distance called back and forth. Conversations were carried on at top voice. Once even a whole party hurried across the floor from one side of the barn to the other. Annixter emerged from the harness room, his face red with wrangling. He took a position to the right of the door, shaking hands with newcomers, inviting them over and over again to cut loose and whoop it along. Into the ears of his more intimate male acquaintances he dropped a word as to punch and cigars in the harness room later on, winking with vast intelligence. Ranchers from remoter parts of the country appeared. Garnett from the Ruby Rancho, Keast from the ranch of the same name, Gethings of the San Pablo, Chattern of the Bonanza, and others and still others, a score of them, elderly men for the most part, bearded, slow of speech, deliberate, dressed in broadcloth. Old Broderson, who entered with his wife on his arm, fell in with this type, and with them came a certain Dabney, of whom nothing but his name was known, a silent old man who made no friends, whom nobody knew or spoke to, who was seen only upon such occasions as this, coming from no one knew where, going no one cared to inquire whither. Between 8 and half-past, Magnus Derrick and his family were seen. Magnus' entry caused no little impression. Some said, "There's the governor," and called their companions' attention to the thin, erect figure, commanding, imposing, dominating all in his immediate neighborhood. Aaron came with him, wearing a cutaway suit of black. He was undeniably handsome, young and fresh-looking, his cheeks highly colored, quite the finest looking of all the younger men. Blond, strong, with that certain courtliness of manner that had always made him liked. He took his mother upon his arm and conducted her to a seat by the side of Mrs. Broderson. Annie Derrick was very pretty that evening. She was dressed in a grey silk gown with a collar of pink velvet,